Okay, quick video here on grain in Lightroom. And this is a super simple little tool, but it's got a lot of different looks you can make with it. And so if you're ever applying grain to your images and want to get a little bit more understanding of how this tool works, I'm going to show you. First off, grain is one of those things I put on almost all my images. And the reason is that sometimes it takes a little bit of the edge off of a digital look, or sometimes noise reduction in our cameras or in post can make things kind of look waxy and weird. And adding a little bit of grain can help bring out some texture, even though it's somewhat artificial. But I thought this photo here was a pretty good example because it's shot at ISO 100 at a slower shutter, 1/15. And you can zoom in and you can see that all their skin looks fairly plasticky, and it doesn't feel real because of the motion blur was kind of smoothing everything out, and then it's already at ISO 100, so it's already perfectly clean and smooth. And then they were in slightly out of focus here because the focus was on here, so you get this strange sort of almost synthetic look to some of the colors and the tones. So just adding a little bit of grain can just make it feel more natural. And another thing is, if you look at the motion blur here, because I did want motion blur in these, you kind of see some of those sort of layering or artifacts that motion blur can kind of have sometimes. It creates almost a ghosting sometimes effect, and just throwing on a little bit of grain just completely hides that. So you can just tell it's a little bit softer, but it's not streaky. There's a few ways to do grain. You can do a really heavy grain, or you can do a crispy or a soft grain. And I'm going to show you how I do each one of those. Pretty much with a lighter grain versus medium versus heavy, a lot of it comes between your amount and your size. So if you want a really heavier grain, you just turn up the size and turn up the amount. Or if you want a tighter grain, just turn up the amount and down the size. But there's a thing you got to watch out for, because you can very quickly get weird, nasty, disease-looking grain. And that's where roughness comes in. With roughness and size, you can use it to kind of define if you want your grain to be really crisp or really soft. I've found that when the size and the roughness, when those two sliders are closer to each other, you're going to get a softer grain. And when they're farther away from each other, you're going to get a crisper grain. So if you go look at my medium grain here, crisp, you can see that the sliders are pretty far apart. I have roughness all the way up, size down a little bit, and then the amount is kind of up. And then with soft, I've brought those two together. Size is a little bit bigger here, and then if you turn up the amount, it's gonna be just, you can see it's a softer grain versus the crispier one. So when would you want to use a crispy grain or a softer grain? It just depends. I usually aim for a crisp grain, but sometimes if I want an image to look a little bit more film-like or a little bit more organic or natural, and I just want to take off the digital edge, I'll go for maybe a softer grain, but typically I have a crisp grain. So you can see how I've built these presets. The fine grain is something I just default on everything, kind of, where it just adds just a little bit. You can't really see the grain, but you can feel that it's there, and that's kind of what I apply to most things. But on a shot like this, I would do either a light or a medium crisp grain. And then also you have to take into consideration your exports. So if you're exporting something to show on a web versus if you're exporting a giant print on your wall, you're gonna have to play with your grain size as well. If I'm just doing something for Instagram and it's planned as a little thumbnail, I'm gonna go for a heavier grain to make it just more obvious and more visible that there's grain on the image. Versus if I were to do a big print or something, I would probably just do a really light grain just to take off some of the artifacts, mask some of the artifacts and some of the edge, little chromatic aberrations, little edge noises and halos you get from sharpening things, and just a little bit of a crisp grain or a softer grain could just take that edge off. And then one last tip. So you don't want to get your roughness typically below your size. I've kind of found that when the roughness goes below the size, that's when you start getting the alien grain. And when the roughness is always above, you usually have a more natural looking grain. And then you can just kind of play with the size and the roughness depending on what shot you have, what megapixel count your camera has, and it's all up to you. So let me click through these. You guys can just see what I'm doing. So here's my fine grain, 15-30-50. Here's my light crisp. Here's my light soft. Here's my medium grain crisp. Here's my medium grain soft. Here's my heavy grain crisp. Here's my heavy grain soft. And these are all my presets. So if you guys have my presets, just be sure to take advantage of these. They're at the bottom here. And that's it for grain. So hopefully that was useful to you guys. I know it's like a really simple and basic thing, but having just a little bit better understanding of it can enhance your images just a little bit, even if it's making your grain crispier or softer. So that's it. I'll see you guys next time.